Let's try a little experiment. Assuming you're not driving a vehicle or operating a machine, extend your hands out in front of your face, elbows locked, palms in. Imagine not being able to see your hands from that distance or the ground that you are walking on. Have you ever been in a fog so thick that you could not drive without someone walking in front of the car to guide you? How long did that last? Minutes? Hours? How about days? Could you imagine not being able to find your way home from across the street? That's how bad it was in London for a stretch of 5 days in early December 1952. Londoners struggled to find their way to work and home again, to keep the soot and dust out of their hair and clothes, and to somehow with great effort find a way to breathe. Yet, while thousands of Londoners were dying from the pollutants in the air, most carried on with their regular business, unaware that anything unusual was happening. After all, this was London, home of the Pea-Souper. Acclimatization is the process in which an individual organism adjusts to a gradual change in its environment. That is, within its own lifetime, an individual organism can acclimate itself to prolonged changes in weather or the environment. It is opposed to adaptation, which involves many organisms over several generations responding to extreme changes. A classic example of acclimatization comes from the documentary film by Al Gore, called An Inconvenient Truth. In this example, Gore speaks of a frog placed in a mildly warm pot of water. The pot of water is very gradually heated until it reaches boiling. The frog acclimates itself to the increasing temperature of the water, unaware that it is being slowly boiled alive. It was a theoretical discussion, and it's debatable whether a frog would continue to sit in a pot of water that is getting gradually more and more uncomfortable and dangerous. But what if we had a real-life example of acclimatization? What if the citizens of the world's largest city were in their own theoretical pot of slowly warming water? Would they stay in the pot even though it was obvious that their environment was getting increasingly more dangerous? Today's episode is about a calamity that was years in the making. And when the disaster actually struck, very few people were aware just how bad their situation had become. London is a foggy city. That almost goes without saying. It is difficult to envision a stroll along the Thames without picturing a foggy evening. But for a number of centuries, London was also a smoky city. England, after all, is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. Charles Dickens described it this way in his 1853 novel Bleak House. Smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes. Gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Fog everywhere. Fog down the river, where it rolls defiled among the tears of shipping, and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. The use of coal in England most probably goes back to Roman provincial times. There are records of coal being mined and used as fuel in England as early as the 13th century. But extraction and production really picked up following the invention of the steam engine and the Industrial Revolution that followed. That revolution led to the building of numerous factories across Britain, and all were powered by James Watt's new steam engine, which used coal for fuel. Giant chimney stacks belched smoke and toxic gases into the air. These man-made smoke particles mixed with the natural water droplets found in fog to produce what Dr. Henry Antoine Deveau would later term smog. There are reports of a dark smog smelling of coal tar blanketing London as early as December 1813. The smog was so thick that residents at the time said that a person could not see from one side of the street to the other. All of this was long before the invention of the coal-fueled locomotive or gasoline-powered automobile. Another smog event in December 1873 saw the death rate across London rise to 40% above normal. Other fatal fog events occurred in January 1880, February 1882, December 1891, December 1892, and November 1948. Usually the worst affected area was the East End, where the density of factories and homes was greater than almost anywhere else in the city. 19th century London was a rapidly expanding city. much of it the result of the Industrial Revolution, when poor people in the countryside flocked to factory jobs in the city. The population of London in 1801 was just under 1 million. By 1861 it was nearly 3 million, and by the end of World War II it had mushroomed to 8.5 million, making it the most populous city in the world. With such rapid growth came problems. One famous instance of unintended consequences from this rapid growth was the Great Stink of 1858. In the 1830s, the flush toilet replaced the chamber pot in many London homes. However, there was no accompanying change to the city's sewage system to accommodate the increased water usage. Outflow went into the street gutters, which were designed only for carrying rain runoff. This continued until the steaming hot summer of 1858, when the foul smell of raw sewage throughout the city finally prompted the House of Commons to address the problem. Around the same time, Dr. John Snow helped contain an outbreak of cholera in the city by proving that the disease was caused by raw sewage leaking into wells residents were using for their drinking water. Previously, it was thought that gases or mists caused cholera. It was another example of the rapidly expanding city coming to grips with how it disposed of its waste products. During World War II, Londoners were subjected to the Blitz, the bombing of their city by Nazi Germany. In response to the Blitz, which killed more than 30,000 Brits, Londoners were forced into cramped, dank air raid shelters, which were often converted tube stations. The Blitz had the effect of bringing Londoners together for a crisis in a communal atmosphere. It showed their ability to persevere through the harshest circumstances and get through the worst of times by relying on the resolve of one another. The currently popular "Keep Calm" meme is based on government-issued posters from that time. As a result, Londoners tended to shrug off large-scale inconveniences, such as crippling smog. There was even a name for such types of thick, hazy smog. They were called Pea-Soupers, and they were becoming more and more prevalent throughout the 20th century. A number of factors were contributing to the worsening conditions. By the end of World War II, the vast majority of London homes were using coal for heating. One study from the time cited that up to 95% of the smoke in London's air was coming from the more than 700,000 chimneys located on tops of flats and houses. Add to that the pollution emitted by factory stacks, coal-powered trains, gasoline-powered automobiles, and diesel-powered city buses. Also, most electrical power stations such as the Fulham, Kingston, and Battersea of Pink Floyd cover art fame were burning coal to produce electricity. It is worth noting that the quality of the coal was a contributing factor as well. Whereas in the 1920s and 1930s most of Britain's best coal had gone to fuel ships and locomotives, that was no longer the case. The better quality coal was being exported. In order to raise revenue for rebuilding after the war, the UK shipped its highest quality coal abroad, leaving its lowest quality and dirtiest burning coal for domestic use. Under normal conditions, this did not present too much of a problem as long as the winds continued to blow and clear the haze out of the city. But that was often not the case in winter when the cold weather arrived. On the evening of December 5, 1952, hundreds of feet above London, a meteorological occurrence known as an anticyclone was forming. An anticyclone is a high-pressure area that prevents outside air currents from flowing in. It allowed a warmish cap of air to settle above London, and it pushed down on the colder air beneath it. In this way, the anticyclone acted much like a lid on a jar. Chimney smoke, which normally rose up and out of the atmosphere, instead clung to the ground and stayed put. While the anticyclone prevented cleaner air from cycling through, it also kept the smoky air on the ground from leaving. The hazy air was trapped over a city that continued to burn more and more pollutant-producing fuel as the days grew colder and darker. Recently, I witnessed this same event in Seattle. It's bizarre to watch gray smoke from log-burning fires drift lazily out of chimneys and hang inches above the ground without dissipating. And if you've ever received a spare the air weather alert in your area, you know what I'm talking about. Clear skies dawned over London that day. An unusual cold snap had gripped the city for weeks, and as Londoners awoke, coal fireplaces worked overtime to take the chill from the air. As the day progressed, a light veil of fog began to enshroud Big Ben, St. Paul's Cathedral, and the rest of the city. By the afternoon, though, the fog began to turn a sickly shade of yellow as it mixed with thousands of tons of soot being pumped into the skies of London by its forest of chimneys and industrial smokestacks. The 30-mile-wide noxious cloud of smog, teeming with acrid sulfur particles, reeked like rotten eggs. It was so dense that residents in the Isle of Dogs district reported they were unable to see their feet as they walked. From December 5th through December 9th, the great smog paralyzed London and crippled all transportation, except for its underground. Boat traffic on the Thames came to a halt. Flights were grounded and train trips canceled. Even during the middle of the day, drivers turned on their headlights and hanged their heads out their windows in an attempt to putter ahead through the yellow gloom. Many found the exercise futile and left their cars behind. Conductors, grasping flashlights and torches, walked in front of the city's iconic double-decker buses to guide drivers nosing down the city streets. Wheezing pedestrians groped their ways around the city's neighborhoods and tried not to slip on the greasy black ooze that coated sidewalks. By the time they returned home with their faces blackened by the air, Londoners resembled coal miners. Visibility across London grew increasingly worse by the hour. In some places, pedestrians couldn't see their own feet. Just the act of walking became a treacherous adventure. Many people didn't venture outside for fear of getting lost in their own neighborhood. The darkness and the haze caused numerous problems. The greyhound races at White City were canceled because the dogs couldn't see the hare. A performance of Verdi's La Traviata was shut down, not only because of the incessant coughing from an audience hacking with respiratory distress, but because the smog was so dense inside that patrons couldn't see the stage. Movie theaters shuttered their doors for the same reason. The smog from outside entered the cinema whenever the doors were opened. In short time, it became impossible for the audience to see the film on the screen, even from the front row. There seemed to be no escape from the smog. It was outdoors and indoors, and the total lack of sunlight caused the air to grow even colder, and so more Londoners piled more coal on their fires. As birds around London smashed into buildings they could not see, people abandoned their cars on roadsides as they could no longer see the road in front of them. The traffic that did get through moved at a snail's pace. Visibility was so bad that any kind of vehicular travel involved taking your life into your own hands. Barbara Fuster, a ballet dancer at the time, recalled her experience getting around in the great smog. It was the worst fog that I'd ever encountered. It had a yellow tinge and a strong, strong smell of sulfur, because it was really pollution from coal fires that had built up. Even in daylight, it was a ghastly yellow color. I'd gone out with my fiancée for dinner. At the end of the evening, we drove off toward Kingston upon Thames, where I was staying, when the smog hit us like a wall. It was absolutely solid. It was a terrifying journey. The only thing to do was for me to walk in front of the car. My fiancé hung out the window while I walked, in my evening clothes and evening shoes, in front to guide him. In those days, if you had headlights up in the fog, they didn't help you very much. They just reflected off the fog. We inched our way down Hampstead Hill in this dreadful smog, with just sidelights to guide us. I had to be very near those sidelights for him to be able to see me. We couldn't stop, as that was far more dangerous than keeping going. Somebody would ram you because you couldn't see a car's taillights until you were on top of them. After a long time we arrived at Kew Bridge, 10 miles from Hampstead, when my fiancée called out to me, "I've lost you. Where have you got to?" I must have veered off out of range of the sidelights. At that point, a milk delivery truck passed by, and my fiancé told me to get in so we could follow its taillights. The milk truck driver put his foot down on the accelerator. Well, then the milkman disappeared until we heard the truck bouncing over the grass on Kew Green. All I could do was get out of the car and continue walking. We later came across a car that had overtaken us earlier on the journey. It was up a tree, crashed, and no sign of the occupant. We eventually got to Kingston at 5 a.m, absolutely black as sweeps. As it was so cold, for fog brings the cold with it, I was wearing a woolly yellow scarf, and that too was pitch black with soot and muck. Our faces were black, our noses were black, and everything was filthy. And we were exhausted, of course. You literally could not see your hand in front of your face. My partner of today tells me that he remembers the smog in that he brushed against what he thought was a human being and asked it for a light for his cigarette, and the human being turned out to be a lamppost. Dr. Donald Atchison, a resident medical officer at Middlesex Hospital, described his experiences. As for my personal recollection of the smog itself, at its worst it had the effect of completely disorienting me in part of London I knew very well, so that I lost my way on a minor errand from the hospital to Oxford Street, 400 yards away. To get my bearings and discover where I was, I had to creep on the pavement along the walls of the buildings to the next corner to read the name of the street. I do not recall any sulfur smell, but I do remember an eerie silence as there was little or no traffic. Visibility was less than 3 meters, and it was bitterly cold. Richard Scorer was a meteorology professor at Imperial College. He said, "The only thing I can remember was what Pat Lawther, an expert on air pollution, told me, that I should breathe through my nose, and people who breathed through their mouth got a lot of muck into their lungs, whereas in the nose, the nasal passages were specially designed to capture anything. And I must have got through clean handkerchiefs in very large numbers, but I never had a breathing problem. I can remember trying to cycle from my home in Wimbledon to my place of work in South Kensington, and I had planned to do this by bike always. So that was a distance of 7 miles. Well, I had to give up attempting that while the smog was actually on. But I do remember cycling down the road from Wimbledon to Rains Park, in which I followed the curb on the edge of the pavement very closely. It was about the only thing I could see. I think the visibility was about 1 yard at the worst time. But the most significant thing that happened to me was that I became very dirty. My eyebrows were covered with what you might call mud. My hair was filthy, and my hands had collected a lot of muck from the air, not from the ground. The severe weather conditions led to a rise in crime. Since police forces were practically incapacitated, and people walking down the street couldn't see more than a foot in front of them, muggers attacked and robbed people or broke into houses with impunity. One Londoner recalled as a child he could nick anything he wanted. Shopkeepers refused to chase fleeing children into the cloak of the yellow smog, fearful that they may not find their way back to their shops. The first noticed casualties were cattle at the Smithfield show in Earl's Court. Farmers had spent hours trying to reach the capital. When they finally arrived, they found many of their livestock had breathing difficulties. And Aberdeen Angus died, and 12 other cattle had to be slaughtered because of the severity of their condition. 60 others needed major veterinary treatment, and about 100 more needed minor attention. All were relatively young and in prime condition. Breeders eventually fashioned improvised gas masks for their cattle by soaking grain sacks in whiskey and stringing these across the animals' faces. Smog masks, basically repurposed cotton surgical masks, became a very popular item at pharmacies. Donald Atchison recalled, "The fog itself swirled into the wards and seemed to consist principally of smuts, so that the wash basins and baths turned darker and darker gray, until it was possible literally to write one's name on them, which I actually did. Within a day or two I had to telephone the senior surgeon to ask leave to cancel all admissions from the waiting lists until further notice. He agreed. As I remember, the patients themselves, they were middle-aged and elderly people, principally men gasping for breath, with remarkably little in the way of wheezes or rattles. Usually when one listens with a stethoscope to the chest of people with asthma or other respiratory illnesses, one can hear these noises in the chest. Within a few days, patients with acute respiratory distress spilled over into all wards, regardless of the specialty or gender. In other words, they were in the surgical wards, and even the obstetric wards. And as the majority were men, room had to be found in some of the women's wards. The supply of oxygen was stretched to the limit. There were also many deaths. The morticians ran out of space in the mortuary and in the chapel of rest, and the staff had to use the anatomy department's dissecting room in another building. Bearing in mind the extreme loss of visibility in the streets, I would expect that many people died at home without medical help, Atchison said. Rosemary Merritt was a schoolgirl back in 1952. Her father worked at a London bus garage. He already suffered from bronchitis. Because of transport disruptions, he was forced to walk an hour and a half through the smog to get home. Merritt remembers him walking through the front door. He was not breathing very well and coughing quite a lot, she said. We went to bed, and in the middle of the night, I was woken up by my mum banging on doors. My father had been taken worse, and my mum was really worried about him because he was going blue, apparently. Merritt said the doctor couldn't even make it to their house, so she and her mother tried to go and get medicine for him. We got to the doctor's, picked up these tablets, and came back home. We were greeted at the front door by the neighbors who had looked after my dad to tell my mum he'd died. The worst effect of the smog was the respiratory distress it caused, including difficulty breathing and the vomiting of phlegm. The sulfur dioxide and hydrogen chloride gas mixed with oxygen and moisture in the air to form sulfuric and hydrochloric acid that burned people's eyes and lungs. Those compounds contributed to the difficulty Londoners were having seeing through the haze. In addition to numerous automobile accidents, the smog caused several rail accidents, including a collision between two trains near London Bridge. By December 6th, 500 people had died, and the ambulances had stopped going out. There were too many abandoned cars on the road, and the visibility was so poor that rescue workers had to walk ahead of their vehicles to get around. Thousands of people walked to hospitals, arriving, gasping for breath, their lips turned blue due to asphyxiation. The Great Smog ended on Tuesday, December 9th, when a cold front blew in from the Atlantic and cleared out the air over Britain. In terms of lives lost and lives impacted, the Great Smog represented the worst environmental disaster up to that time. Recent research indicates that as many as 12,000 people may have died as a result of the smog, including 4,000 the week of December 5th. The mortality rate from respiratory illnesses such as bronchitis and pneumonia increased more than sevenfold during the smog. Overall death rates during the first half of that smog were 3 times higher than normal, and morbidity and mortality rates in Greater London remained elevated well into March of 1953. The death rate in the worst affected area, the East End, increased 9-fold. During the period of the fog, huge amounts of impurities were released into the atmosphere. On each day during the foggy period, the following pollutants were emitted: 1,000 tons of smoke particles, 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide, 140 tons of hydrochloric acid, and 14 tons of fluorine compounds. In addition, and perhaps most dangerously, 370 tons of sulfur dioxide were converted into 800 tons of sulfuric acid when it reacted with the oxygen in the atmosphere. Inhaling sulfur dioxide is associated with increased respiratory symptoms and disease, difficulty in breathing, and premature death. Sulfuric acid is also the main ingredient in acid rain. During the 4 days between December 4th and 8th, smoke measurements taken at the National Gallery in London suggest that the particulate matter concentration reached 14 milligrams per cubic meter, which was 56 times the level normally experienced at the time, and the levels of sulfur dioxide in the air increased by 7-fold, peaking at around 700 parts per billion. Dr. Robert Waller was working at St. Bartholomew's Hospital during the Great Smog. The interesting thing is that no one realized at the time that the number of deaths were increasing, he said. The London press continued to report on the inconveniences caused by the low visibility rather than the health concerns. There weren't bodies lying around in the street, and no one really noticed that more people were dying. One of the first indications was that undertakers were running out of coffins and florists were running out of flowers. The number of deaths per day during and just after that smog were 3 to 4 times the normal. Hospitals filled up quickly as the medical staff struggled to cope with the pollution. There were many patients admitted, but there were too many affected, Waller said, and they apparently couldn't get into the hospitals, so they perished outside. For those taken ill, the effects included short-term decrease in breathing ability and an increase in chest pains, inflammation of the lungs and damage to respiratory cells, permanent lung damage and reduced quality of life due to ozone, increased number of asthma attacks due to nitrogen dioxide, a lack of oxygen in the bloodstream in those with heart disease due to carbon monoxide, increased risk of cancer. Major causes of death were pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis, heart failure. Many of the deceased were from vulnerable populations, the elderly, young children, and people with existing medical conditions like asthma, bronchitis, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. As a direct result of the massive illnesses, suffering, and death caused by the Great Smog, the British House of Commons took action. This included the City of London's Various Powers Act of 1954 and the Clean Air Acts of 1956 and 1968. The Clean Air Act of 1956 introduced a number of measures to reduce air pollution, especially by introducing smoke control areas in some towns and cities in which only smokeless fuels could be burnt. Residents of urban areas and factories were required to convert to smokeless fuels. By shifting home sources of heat towards cleaner coals, electricity, and gas, it reduced the amount of smoke pollution and sulfur dioxide from household fires. Reinforcing these changes, the Act also included measures to relocate power stations away from cities. The Clean Air Act of 1968 made it an offense to emit dark smoke and mandated minimum chimney heights for industries burning coal, liquid, or gaseous fuels. Citizens were given time to adapt to the new rules, however, and the fogs continued to be smoky for some time after the passage of the 1956 Act. For example, in 1962, a similar fog event was responsible for killing 750 people. And in 1991, another London smog resulted in the deaths of 160 people. That kind of smog is now much more rare, thanks partly to the pollution legislation and also to modern developments such as the widespread use of central heating. Air quality in London today is vastly improved. However, like many urban areas, it continues to be compromised by carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, and other pollutants. So 60 years later, has the rest of the world learned from London's mistakes? As recently as October 2013, the cities of Beijing and Harbin, China, suffered through a horrendous smog event. During a 3-day period, particulate matter rose to 1,000 micrograms per cubic meter. At the height of the Great London Smog, the level was 1,600. For comparison, a level above 300 is considered hazardous, and the World Health Organization recommends a daily level no higher than 20. The smog in China closed down schools and airports and brought traffic to a standstill. Visibility was reduced to below 160 feet. While the Chinese government is yet to release mortality figures, researchers at Greenpeace estimate that Beijing alone suffered 2,589 deaths because of smog-related air pollution in 2012. And can you guess what source of fuel most of China uses to heat its homes? That's right, it's coal. In fact, China currently burns nearly half of the world's coal. Thus we wait for a 21st century version of Charles Dickens to step forward in China. Thank you for joining me for the Podcast of Doom. I appreciate the patience you've shown through the holiday break. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoom, pod@gmail.com, or visit me at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. If you really like the podcast, were completely disgusted, or just happen to have a few available moments, please find the Podcast of Doom on iTunes and post a comment. I love doing this podcast, but I also need your help to expand our audience. You can follow me on Twitter or like me on Facebook. Until next time, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.